At my sister's wedding, they stuck me behind a pillar, out of sight, as if I weren't even family. I stayed quiet, acting like it didn't bother me, until a stranger slid into the seat beside me and whispered, "Just follow my lead and act like you're my date." Moments later, he stood to speak. Every head snapped toward us, and my sister's smile vanished instantly. "You know, just 7 months ago, I was living what I thought was a perfect life. My marriage was solid, my job was stable, and my best friend? She was like family. But then, in one brutal, gut-wrenching moment, I walked into my own bedroom and found my husband in bed with her. What if I told you that wasn't even the start of it? What if that shocking betrayal was just a tiny piece of a much larger, darker plot, carefully unraveling my entire existence?" Everything exploded that day. My comfortable, happy world shattered into a million pieces. Now I was clinging to survival in a cheap motel room, the walls practically reeking of regret and cigarette smoke. I was haunted by this crushing weight of betrayal, and an injustice so profound it still, even now, steals my breath. I felt like I'd finally hit rock bottom. My husband, Justin, had been sleeping with Natalie, my best friend, for God knows how long. When I caught them, everything just disintegrated. And it wasn't just my marriage. 2 agonizing weeks later, I lost my job. The divorce, a vicious, calculated affair, left me with absolutely nothing. My friends, the ones I thought cared, they just stopped calling. I went from a perfectly normal, middle-class life to pure, unadulterated chaos in less than 2 months. I was sitting there, on the edge of that squeaky motel bed, trying to eat instant ramen with a plastic fork, when I spotted something strange tucked away underneath. An old, brown leather suitcase. Brass corners, faded and green with age. And a luggage tag with my full name, written in the unmistakable, elegant hand of my Aunt Helen. Helen. She'd passed away 9 months earlier, a few months before everything imploded. She was always the eccentric family member everyone just wrote off as difficult, paranoid, a bit much. I pulled the suitcase out, found a tiny key taped to the bottom, and opened it. Inside? $70,000 in cold, hard cash. And a note. A single piece of paper that blew apart everything I thought I knew about my life. That note, it warned me, don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. It said they'd been plotting my downfall since before my wedding day. And then came the real gut punch. My mother's death, 6 years ago, wasn't an accident. The note gave me an address in Portland, promising a real fortune and chilling instructions to finish what my mother had started before they silenced her. Helen, the one everyone called crazy, had spent her final years collecting evidence, meticulously, secretly. And now, she was giving me a choice. Take the money and vanish. Or use it to fight back against the very people who had systematically shredded my life. My name is Samantha Garrett. And before the world shattered, my life looked normal. Almost painstakingly so. I had this cozy 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. Mrs. Chin down the hall always smiled. The maintenance guy actually showed up when stuff broke. It wasn't fancy, you know. The walls were thin, and the carpet had these impossible stains from old tenants. But Justin and we'd painted that living room together. We spent an entire Saturday wrestling with flat-pack furniture and hung our wedding photos on the wall where the afternoon light just made everything feel warmer than it probably was. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Brennan & Associates, a mid-sized firm. Local businesses, social media for restaurants, website redesigns for dentists, email blasts for boutiques. It wasn't the high-flying career I dreamed of in college, but it paid the bills. $48,000 a year, plus benefits. Enough for my half of the rent, groceries, and the occasional dinner out when we wanted to pretend we had more disposable income. My boss, Marcus Brennan, he was professional but distant. He'd compliment your work, but never quite promote you. He'd ask about your weekend, but you always knew he wasn't really listening. I'd been there for years, consistently reliable, always praised, never advanced. But I didn't question it. I showed up at 8:30, made coffee, sat at my desk with its view of the parking lot, and just did my job. It felt stable. Predictable. Safe. Justin was a business consultant, or so he said. His schedule was always chaotic, but it seemed normal for his field. Late nights finishing proposals, sudden trips to Seattle or San Francisco, conference calls at odd hours. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, warm up leftovers, and fall asleep on the couch with his laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket, feeling this weird mix of affection and loneliness. Proud of how hard he worked, but resentful of how little time we actually spent together. We'd met 7 years ago at a dinner party. Or at least, that's what I believed. He was so charming that night. He asked about my work and actually listened. His jokes were clever, not mean. He even offered to help clean up. He asked for my number, and I gave it to him, trying not to seem too eager. Our courtship felt so natural, so easy, like we were just meant to be. Dinners, city walks, lazy Sunday mornings reading in bed. He proposed after 18 months, on one knee in the park where we'd had our third date. I said yes without a single doubt. Why would I? But then, over the last 2 years, things had started to shift. Subtly at first. Justin got super protective of his phone, always tilting the screen away, taking calls in other rooms. Face down on the table during dinner. He got vague about his projects, giving me these broad strokes instead of the detailed stories he used to share. He started picking fights over the smallest things, the way I loaded the dishwasher, organic versus regular vegetables, even how much time I spent talking to Natalie. Natalie. My best friend since college. We were broke students then, splitting ramen, dreaming about our futures. She was my maid of honor, crying during my wedding, which of course made me cry. She helped us move, lugging boxes, cracking jokes. Every Thursday for 5 years, she'd come over with a bottle of wine, and we'd talk about everything. Work frustrations, her latest dating disasters, my growing concerns about Justin and me drifting apart. She'd listen with this incredible, genuine sympathy, nodding, saying things like, "All marriages have phases, Sam. You two just need to reconnect." She'd tell me how lucky I was to have Justin, how most men weren't as supportive. How I shouldn't take what I had for granted. And I believed her. Because questioning your best friend, it feels like questioning reality itself. If you can't trust the person who's been by your side for over a decade, who can you trust? My mother, Catherine, died 6 years earlier. A car accident on a rainy night. Her car wrapped around a tree on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. The police said she was speeding, maybe fell asleep. A tragic accident. My Aunt Helen, her older sister, insisted something was wrong. Everyone, myself included, dismissed it as grief talking. Helen was always the difficult one. You know, the family member who'd show up with pamphlets about corporate corruption and warnings about trusting the wrong people. When she died 9 months ago, alone in her house, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers, I felt guilty. Guilty for not visiting more, for not taking her seriously, for writing her off as paranoid when maybe she was just seeing patterns the rest of us were too comfortable to notice. I went to work every day, paid my bills, kept the apartment clean, tried to be a good wife. I did everything right, according to the unspoken rules of middle-class respectability. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, trusted the right people, played by the rules, I'd be safe, protected from the kind of chaos you only read about happening to other people. I thought doing everything right mattered. That loyalty meant something. That the life I'd built was real. Looking back now, from this dingy motel room with its cigarette-stained walls and that god-awful squeaky bed, I can see how impossibly naive I was. How carefully constructed my entire life had been by people who saw me not as human, but as a tool. How every relationship I'd trusted was just performance art, designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. The apartment. The job. The marriage. The friendship. All of it built on foundations that were never real. But I didn't know that then. Not 7 months ago. Living my normal life, believing in routine and the protection of rules that turned out to be written by people who never intended to follow them. I didn't know Justin and Natalie had been planning my destruction since before my wedding. I didn't know my mother's death wasn't an accident. I didn't know Aunt Helen had spent her final years collecting evidence while everyone just laughed at her. I didn't know any of it. Not until I found that suitcase with $70,000 and a note that forced me to choose between disappearing and fighting back. And by then, I'd already lost everything I thought mattered. The suitcase was on the motel bed beside me now. That $70K in cash, spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Helen's note, soft from being folded and unfolded so many times, was clutched in my hand. I read it again, the words rewriting my entire history. They'd been planning this since before your wedding. My mother's death wasn't an accident. Finish what she started before they silenced her. I needed to understand. How had I missed it? How had I lived inside this lie for 7 years without seeing the truth? So, I let myself remember that Tuesday, 6 months ago. The day my comfortable illusions finally shattered beyond repair. I woke up feeling sick to my stomach. Not just a stomach bug, something deeper. A wrongness that made it hard to breathe. I tried to ignore it. Going through my routine, shower, puffy toast I couldn't finish. Getting dressed for work while Justin slept in, claiming a late meeting. By 10 a.m., I was at my desk at Brennan & Associates, staring at a social media calendar for a dental office, and I just couldn't focus. My hands were cold. My heart raced. The nausea got worse. Finally, I walked into Marcus's office and told him I needed to go home. I expected a fight. Marcus wasn't the type to let people leave early. But he just looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read and said, "Feel better." In a tone that made the hair on my neck stand up, like he already knew something I didn't. Like he was relieved I was leaving. The drive home took 20 minutes. I kept the radio off. Noise felt like too much. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Probably just a stomach bug. Anxiety making it worse. But the dread just grew, block by block. This certainty that something was profoundly wrong. When I pulled into our parking lot, I saw Natalie's silver Honda Civic in a visitor spot. She had a key to our apartment. She'd stop by sometimes if her internet was acting up. It shouldn't have been strange. But on a Tuesday afternoon, when Justin was supposed to be at the office and Natalie at her own apartment, something about it felt wrong. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine running, trying to talk myself out of the feeling in my gut. They were working on something. A surprise for me, maybe. Justin came home sick, and Natalie was checking on him. I cycled through a dozen innocent explanations, each one more desperate than the last. I finally turned off the engine and walked 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again. Down the hallway with its worn carpet and flickering light. I put my key in the lock as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have told you why stealth felt necessary. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside. But not empty quiet. Occupied quiet. That feeling you get when you know people are home even when you can't hear them. I stood in the living room, work bag still over my shoulder, just listening. And then I heard it. Laughter from our bedroom. Natalie's laughter. But not her normal laugh. Not the one she used when we watched comedies or when I said something genuinely funny. This was different. Lower. More intimate. The kind of laugh meant for someone specific, designed to make that person feel special, desired. I'd heard her use it before, years ago, when she was dating someone she really liked back in college, when everything was less complicated. I stood there, frozen in my own living room, staring at the closed bedroom door. My brain worked overtime, desperately constructing explanations to keep my crumbling narrative intact. Maybe she was on the phone. Maybe Justin wasn't even home. Maybe I was just sick and paranoid. But deep down, beneath all the desperate rationalizations, I knew. I already knew what I was going to find. I crossed the living room. Each step felt like an hour. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door? I just turned the handle and pushed it open. Justin and Natalie. In my bed. Tangled in the gray sheets I'd just washed 3 days earlier. They were looking at each other with an intimacy that doesn't develop in an afternoon. This was familiar territory for them. Comfortable. Routine. When they saw me in the doorway, Natalie's first emotion wasn't shame or guilt. It was annoyance. Like I was the one interrupting something important. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me with this expression that seemed to say, "Why are you making this dramatic? You should have seen this coming." Justin got out of bed, pulling on his jeans with this practiced efficiency that told me everything. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was routine. Something they'd done enough times that the mechanics of it were smooth and automatic. He looked at me with an expression that was somehow worse than guilt. It was impatience mixed with relief. Like this confrontation was inconvenient, but also something he'd been waiting for, because pretending had gotten tiresome. "Sam," he said, in that calm voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The sheer absurdity of that made me almost laugh. It was exactly what it looked like. But he stood there, caught in the most obvious betrayal possible, and tried to gaslight me into questioning my own eyes. Like I was the problem for refusing to accept his twisted version of reality. Natalie sat up, holding the sheet around herself with a modesty that would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. She had the nerve to look at me with something close to pity. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said, as if there's a good way to discover your husband and best friend are having an affair. "But honestly, Sam, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The sheer presumption stole my breath. Not just that she was sleeping with him, but that she thought I should have known. That their betrayal was justified because my marriage had problems I was too stupid or blind to recognize. I asked the question I knew I'd regret. "How long?" My voice sounded strange to me. Too calm. Too detached. Like I was asking about the weather, not the implosion of my entire life. Justin answered in the same emotionless tone. "Does it matter? Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." That word, pretending, it cut deeper than anything else. How long had you been pretending to love me? How long had every kiss goodbye been a performance? Every "I love you" a lie? And Natalie, how long had she been sitting on my couch every Thursday night, drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage problems, offering advice designed to keep me compliant while she was sleeping with my husband the rest of the week? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things. I just turned around, walked back into the living room, and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag from the hall closet. My laptop, chargers, toiletries, the practical things you need when your life collapses. Justin followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have that adult conversation, still acting like this was a reasonable situation that could be resolved with calm discussion. I left without another word. Walked out of the apartment I'd helped pay for. Drove to a coffee shop parking lot 3 miles away and sat in my car, crying until I couldn't breathe. Then I called my cousin Emma and asked if I could crash on her couch. That was 6 months ago. And now, sitting in this motel room with Helen's note and $70,000 in cash, I understood. That Tuesday, it had been even worse than I'd thought. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated. Planned. Part of something so much bigger. Connected to my mother's death. connected to whatever Helen had spent her final years investigating. They'd been playing a long game, with my life as the board. And I'd been too trusting, too naive, too desperate to believe in the stability of a normal life to see what was happening until it was too late. I was on Emma's couch for 5 days when Marcus called. My cousin had been great, letting me use her guest room. And I'd been trying to pretend everything was normal, going to work every day, as if sleeping in someone else's house with all my possessions in a duffel bag was just a temporary inconvenience, not a sign of total collapse. Marcus asked me to come to his office first thing Monday morning. His voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news, but want to sound compassionate. I told myself it was probably a new client or a performance review. I wouldn't let myself think about the alternative. I showed up at 8:15, wearing clothes I'd ironed on Emma's board, trying to look put together, even though I felt like I was barely holding myself intact. Marcus's door was open. He waved me in with an expression that might have been sympathy, or maybe just satisfaction hidden behind a professional mask. "Samantha," he said, gesturing to the chair. "I need to talk to you about some changes in the department." I sat down, hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my face neutral. Marcus shuffled papers, not quite meeting my eyes. My stomach dropped before he even started speaking. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints," he said. That careful corporate language designed to sound official and impersonal. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. We're offering a severance package." He slid a folder across the desk. I didn't touch it. I just stared at him. My brain screamed, "Not now. Not when everything else is falling apart." "Budget constraints?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "We just signed 3 new clients. I've seen the quarterly reports. We're not struggling." Marcus's expression didn't change. "These decisions are made at levels above my control, Samantha. I'm sorry, but the decision is final." I wanted to ask if this had anything to do with Justin. If he'd heard about the separation. But something in his face stopped me. A flicker of discomfort that said asking questions wouldn't change a thing. I took the folder, left his office, packed up my desk in 20 minutes. Nobody made eye contact. My coworkers suddenly became fascinated by their computer screens or found urgent reasons to be in meetings. By 9 a.m., I was walking out of Brennan & Associates with a cardboard box holding 4 years of my professional life and a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I found out Marcus and Justin had been college roommates. Their connection had always been part of the architecture of my life without my knowing. My job had never been secure. It had always been conditional. But that morning, sitting in my car, I just felt the ground shift again. Another support kicked out from under me. The divorce proceedings started 2 weeks after I lost my job. Justin hired Elizabeth Hartley, a shark. An attorney known for winning through aggression and cruelty. My attorney? Court appointed. Gerald Stokes, a tired man who seemed to have given up on justice. Somewhere in the last decade. Elizabeth filed motions painting me as unstable, irresponsible, dangerous. She used the fact I'd lost my job as evidence of my inability to function. My temporary housing, sleeping on Emma's couch, became proof I couldn't manage my own life. Every detail of my current circumstances became ammunition, all designed to justify why Justin deserved everything and I deserved nothing. The judge, Robert Cunningham, a man in his late 50s, had this efficient way of moving through his docket, like he'd already made up his mind. Every motion Elizabeth filed, he approved. Every request Gerald made on my behalf, he denied, barely even glancing at the documents. Justin kept the apartment because his name was first on the mortgage, even though I'd contributed equally for 5 years. He kept the car because I'd missed 2 payments during the chaos. He kept the furniture, the savings, the retirement funds. The settlement left me with my clothes, my laptop, and barely enough for 3 months' rent anywhere. The worst part? It wasn't the material things, or even the financial devastation. It was watching Natalie take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore this navy blue designer suit. I recognized it immediately. We'd picked it out together 2 years earlier on a shopping trip, laughing in dressing rooms. I told her it made her look professional, confident. Now she wore it to testify against me. She sat there, perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, and lied with the kind of conviction that only comes from practice. She told Judge Cunningham I'd been unstable for months, that I'd made concerning comments about self-harm, that I was increasingly paranoid and difficult, that Justin had stayed in the marriage out of obligation and fear, not love. Not a single word was true. But Natalie delivered every lie with perfect emotional calibration, her voice cracking slightly at the right moments, her expression showing concern mixed with reluctance, as if testifying against me was painful but necessary, for my own good. Judge Cunningham listened, nodding sympathetically, taking notes. When Gerald tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Justin, Elizabeth objected before he could finish. The judge sustained it immediately, cutting off any line of inquiry that might reveal when the affair actually started. I sat there, watching my best friend of over a decade systematically destroy what little credibility I had left. And it hit me. This was coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce. All of it timed and executed with a precision that went far beyond coincidence. After the divorce, Emma let me stay in her guest room for 3 weeks. Then her husband, David, started making pointed comments. Not directly to me, of course, but I'd hear him talking to Emma at night. "She can't stay here indefinitely. You're not helping her by letting her avoid dealing with her situation." Emma would defend me, but her voice was tired. I could hear the doubt creeping in, the exhaustion of dealing with someone else's crisis. I started looking for anywhere else to go. My former colleague, Diane, offered her couch for 10 days, then decided my negative energy was impacting her mental health. A college friend offered a week, then remembered family was visiting. Another friend let me stay for 5 days before her roommate complained about a stranger. Everyone was sympathetic right up until sympathy became inconvenient. Right up until supporting me required actual, sustained sacrifice instead of just kind words. Then suddenly they remembered prior commitments, family obligations, personal boundaries. It meant I needed to become someone else's problem. I understood it on some level. No one wants to live with someone else's crisis indefinitely. But the speed with which people retracted their support, it taught me a lot about how conditional most relationships really are. How quickly compassion expires when it becomes uncomfortable. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance social media work to pay for a weekly rate at the Crossroads Motel, it felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finding ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. At least the motel didn't pretend to care. At least Rita at the front desk didn't offer false comfort that would evaporate when I became inconvenient. Room 14 became my address, my home. The place where I'd eventually find a suitcase containing $70,000 and a note that explained why my destruction had been so systematic and so complete. Room 14 at the Crossroads Motel. 3 days after the last friend stopped returning my calls. I'd scraped together $200 from freelance social media work for a local bakery and a pet grooming business, both paying in irregular installments. The motel sat off Highway 52, the kind of place where the weekly rate was displayed more prominently than the nightly rate. The sign out front had been missing letters for so long nobody bothered to fix it. Rita at the front desk had an expression that suggested she'd seen my exact scenario thousands of times. Women alone with duffel bags, desperate eyes, paying weekly rates, pretending this was temporary. She didn't ask questions. She just took my cash, handed me a key attached to a green plastic tag with 14 embossed on it, and recited the rules in a flat voice. Weekly rate includes utilities. Checkout is 11 if you're leaving. No visitors after 10. Laundry room around back, $3 a load. Vending machines take bills or coins. I thanked her and carried my duffel bag across the parking lot to a door that had been painted blue once, faded now to an undecided color. The key stuck. I had to jiggle it 3 times before the mechanism gave way. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered under industrial cleaner. 2 cents fighting a war neither could win. The carpet was a brown pattern designed to hide stains, which meant it was probably hiding decades of them. The bed sagged in the middle like it had given up on supporting anything. A small table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a TV from the early 2000s on a dresser with drawers that didn't close properly. The bathroom was tiny. A shower stall that had seen better years. A mirror that made everything look slightly yellow. This was home now. This was what my life had been reduced to. A room that charged by the week. Where nobody asked questions. Because asking questions might require caring about the answers. I tried to establish some kind of routine to keep myself from completely falling apart. Woke early, made instant coffee, spent mornings applying for jobs online, marketing coordinator, social media manager, anything. I sent out dozens of applications every week, customizing cover letters, updating my resume. Nobody called back. Not even rejection emails. My applications just disappeared into the digital void. In the afternoons, I'd work on freelance projects, small businesses, managing Facebook pages, email newsletters, design graphics. The work paid poorly, arrived sporadically, but it was enough for the weekly motel rate with a little leftover for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen in the microwave. Sometimes I'd splurge on a can of soup or a frozen meal from the convenience store. I'd eat on the edge of the bed, watching TV shows I didn't care about, just for noise, just to drown out my own thoughts. My neighbors were mostly invisible. A long-haul trucker named Dale, who parked his rig in the far corner, nodded sometimes. A woman who worked night shifts kept her curtains permanently closed. A man in his 60s next door played country music just low enough that I couldn't complain, but loud enough to hear through the thin walls. I avoided looking at myself in the bathroom mirror. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Same face, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. Something had broken, not healed. Leaving her looking hollow, defeated, ashamed. This was my life now. This is what betrayal and systematic destruction looked like. A motel room that smelled like smoke and failure. Meals that cost less than $2. And the crushing understanding that nobody was coming to save me. Everyone who might have cared had already decided I was too much trouble. I'd been in room 14 for 3 weeks when I noticed the suitcase under the bed, only because I dropped my phone charger and it rolled under the frame. I got down on my hands and knees to retrieve it, reaching into the dusty space, and my hand hit something solid. Something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled it out into the light. An old suitcase. Battered brown leather, brass corners oxidized to a dull green. It looked like something from another era. A luggage tag was attached to the handle with twine, and when I turned it over, my hands started shaking. Samantha Marie Garrett. My full name. In handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. The precise, careful script of my Aunt Helen. I sat on the floor, holding the suitcase, trying to make sense of how it got there. Helen had died 9 months ago. I'd attended her funeral, stood at her graveside, watched them lower her casket. She'd lived alone for decades. Died alone in her house, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers. Everyone said it was sad, but not surprising given how she'd isolated herself with her conspiracy theories and paranoid warnings. How had her suitcase ended up under my bed? In a motel room I'd only been in for 3 weeks? Had she somehow known I'd end up here? Left it with Rita with instructions? The logistics seemed impossible, but the evidence was right there. My name. Helen's unmistakable handwriting. The suitcase was locked with 2 brass latches. I turned it over, checking the sides and bottom, and found a small plastic bag taped underneath. Inside was a key. Helen had always been paranoid, but also practical. She hid things in plain sight, left clues that required careful looking. Trusted the right person would find what she left behind. I peeled off the tape, removed the key, and unlocked the suitcase. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Inside was money. $70,000 in cash, bundled with rubber bands. Mostly hundreds, some 50s. It smelled faintly of mothballs and old books, like it had been stored for years. Underneath the money, a plane ticket, printed on paper yellowing at the edges. Portland, Oregon. Departure date, 4 days from now. And under the ticket, a note, handwritten on yellow legal paper. In Helen's distinctive script, "Samantha, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth is important. Use it wisely." I read those words 3 times. Each reading making them feel more impossible and more true at the same time. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before your wedding. My mother, Catherine, died 6 years ago. Car accident. Rainy night. Her car wrapped around a tree. Police report said speeding. Maybe fell asleep. A tragic accident. Nothing suspicious. Helen had insisted something was wrong. At the funeral, she pulled me aside. Urgent whisper. My mother was investigating financial fraud at the pharmaceutical company where she worked. Her death was too convenient. The timing didn't make sense. I needed to be careful. I dismissed it. Grief twisting into paranoia. Helen always saw conspiracies. Always warned about corporate corruption. We all learned to nod politely and change the subject. Now I was sitting on the floor of a cheap motel with proof that everything I'd believed about my life was a lie. I spent that night in room 14, staring at the money and the note, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the choice Helen was forcing me to make. By morning, I knew I wasn't running. I was done being the person things happened to. Done disappearing while the people who destroyed my life got to move forward without consequences. I packed my duffel bag with a few possessions. My laptop. The $70K bundled in a waterproof bag. I left a note for Rita at the front desk, paid through the week but won't be returning. She looked at me, an expression that might have been concern or relief. Good luck, she said. It could have meant anything. The flight to Portland left early on a Thursday morning, from a regional airport 40 minutes away. I booked it with Helen's cash. Spent the entire drive trying not to think about what I was actually doing. Flying across the country, following instructions from a dead woman everyone called paranoid, chasing a conspiracy theory that connected my husband's affair to my mother's death. Believing that the systematic destruction of my life was part of something bigger, more calculated than simple betrayal. When I said it like that, it sounded crazy. But Helen's note was in my bag. The money was real. The plane ticket had my name on it. Crazy or not, I was going. The airline was one of those budget carriers that charge extra for everything. I paid the ridiculous fee for my duffel bag, then spent 3 hours wedged between a businessman who monopolized both armrests and a college kid watching videos without headphones. I didn't sleep. The seats were designed by people who hated the human spine. But that wasn't why I stayed awake. My mind wouldn't stop. What had my mother discovered that made her dangerous enough to kill? How deep did Justin and Natalie's involvement go? Had any part of my relationship with Justin been real? Or was it all performance? Every kiss, every I love you, a calculated manipulation. The businessman kept glancing at my duffel bag. I wanted to tell him it contained $70,000 and possibly the key to understanding why my entire life had been dismantled. But I just stared out the window at the darkness, scattered lights below. Cities and towns full of people whose lives probably made sense to them, in ways mine no longer did. Portland greeted me with gray skies and a cold, heavy rain, the kind that seeps into your bones. I rented a car with Helen's cash and a credit card I'd been avoiding. The rental agent barely looked at me. The address Helen had written led me out of the city toward Lake Oswego, a suburb that felt quiet, suggesting money and privacy. Neighbors who minded their own business. The GPS guided me through streets lined with mature trees. Houses set back from the road. Politeness and distance. Helen's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. A small, ranch-style place from the 70s, not updated much. Dark windows. A lawn so wild it screamed, nobody's mowed this in months. The driveway cracked, weeds pushing through. It was the kind of property that screams, someone died here, and nobody knows what to do with it yet. I parked, sat in the rental car for a full minute, engine running, trying to decide if I was brave enough. Helen's note said the truth was waiting. But what if the truth was worse than the lies? What if whatever I found made everything more complicated instead of bringing the clarity I desperately craved? I turned off the engine, got out before I could talk myself out of it. The front door was locked, but Helen had left a second key in the suitcase, taped inside a small envelope-marked house. I let myself in, stepping into stale, undisturbed air. That particular smell of a place where nobody's opened a window, cooked a meal, or lived a real life in months. The interior was exactly as expected. Books everywhere. Stacked on shelves, piled on tables, lined along baseboards. Filing cabinets in the living room, papers organized in boxes, Helen's precise handwriting. The kitchen looked barely used, coffee maker, microwave, sink full of dishes. But the note had directed me to the shed behind the house. I walked through to the back door, into an overgrown yard where grass and weeds had reclaimed what might have been a garden. The shed sat in the far corner, maybe 10 by 12 feet. What stood out immediately? The locks. Newer, industrial. The kind of hardware you use when you're protecting something that matters. Everything else looked old, neglected. But those locks were recent. I used the third key Helen had left, marked shed. It opened smoothly, like it had been recently maintained. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years from the 1980s to last year. Boxes stacked along another wall, indexed with the precision of a professional archive. And in the back corner, hidden under a tarp and some strategically placed paint cans, a trapdoor set into the floor. I moved the paint cans, pulled back the tarp. The trapdoor had a handle and a lock. The fourth key Helen left. It opened, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight, climbed down into what turned out to be a crawl space converted into a climate-controlled evidence room. About 7 feet tall, 15 feet square, lit by battery-powered LED strips that flickered on when I reached the bottom. The air was cool and dry, maintained by a dehumidifier humming quietly in the corner. More filing cabinets. More boxes. A table with a laptop, and what looked like an old cassette player. Scattered photographs and documents in clear plastic sleeves. Helen had spent years building this. A secret archive documenting something she believed was worth preserving, even if everyone thought she was paranoid. I started with the photographs right in front of me, arranged on the table like evidence in a trial. The first one I picked up made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped it. My mother, Catherine, standing between Justin and Natalie at what was clearly some kind of conference. All three wearing name tags and business casual clothing, smiling at the camera like colleagues who knew each other well. The banner in the background said Meridian Pharmaceuticals Annual Research Summit. The date printed on the bottom of the photo, 8 years ago. 8 years. 2 full years before I supposedly met Justin by chance at a dinner party. 2 years before our relationship even began. I stared at that photograph. My brain desperately trying to construct any explanation that would let me cling to any part of the narrative I'd believed. Maybe they met briefly, forgot about it. A coincidence. A mislabeled photo. But I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. Justin hadn't met me by accident. He'd been positioned in my life, deliberately cultivated as a relationship by people who needed access to my mother and saw me as the easiest entry point. I'd been a target before I was a girlfriend, a mark before I was a wife. And every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, every promise about our future, it had all been performance art in service of something I was only now beginning to understand. I sat down the photograph, hands still shaking, and reached for the cassette player. It was old, one of those portable models from the 80s, with built-in speakers and a handle. Next to it, a stack of cassette tapes, each labeled in Helen's handwriting. Dates, names, brief descriptions. I picked up the first one, Justin Garrett and Richard Moss. March 2019. Discussion of Catherine Vaughn. Investigation status. My mother's name. My chest tightened. I loaded the tape. Pressed play. Static. Then voices. My hands went cold. The first voice, Justin. I'd heard that voice every day for 7 years. Heard it tell me he loved me. Heard it make promises about our future. Now I was hearing it discuss my mother like she was a problem that needed solving. Catherine's getting too close, Justin said. His tone businesslike, completely devoid of emotion. She's made copies of the trial data, and she's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Samantha. A second voice responded. Older, more authoritative. Richard Moss. We can't let this go public. The approvals we've secured are worth billions. If she exposes the data manipulation, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, Justin said. But Catherine doesn't discuss work details with Samantha. She's protective. Thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by not involving her in whatever she's investigating. It's actually making my job harder because Samantha doesn't know anything useful. Then we need to consider other options, Richard said. And something in his tone made my blood run cold. More permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one accountant developed a conscience. I paused the tape. I couldn't breathe properly. They were discussing killing my mother. Planning it like it was a business decision, weighing options, considering strategies. And Justin, the man I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, he was part of that conversation. He'd been using me to gather information. And when that didn't work, he'd participated in planning her murder. I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Richard continued. We have people who specialize in this kind of problem. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on rainy nights, on dangerous roads. Nobody questions those. What about afterward? Justin asked. If Catherine dies, Samantha is going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me more access to her life. But there's also that aunt, Helen. She's paranoid and suspicious of everything. If Catherine dies, Helen's going to start asking questions. Let her ask, Richard said dismissively. Nobody takes Helen seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Catherine's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. We clean up thoroughly. Make sure the accident investigation is handled by people we can trust. And move on. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing logistics, contingencies, discussing my mother's murder with the same tone people use when planning a vacation or organizing a work project. When it finally ended, I sat in the silence of Helen's underground archive, trying to process what I'd just heard. Justin hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been a plant from the beginning. Positioned in my life specifically to monitor my mother's investigation into Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He courted me, proposed, married me, all as part of a strategy to gain access to information that might threaten a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. And when using me didn't work, when my mother kept her investigation separate from me, he participated in making it look like an accident on a rainy night. I found more tapes. Conversations between Natalie and someone named Dr. Sarah Chin, apparently Natalie's aunt, a senior researcher at Meridian. These recordings revealed that Natalie had been assigned to befriend me after my mother's death, to make sure I remained isolated, manageable, to monitor whether I showed any signs of investigating what had really happened. Every Thursday wine night? Surveillance. Every heart-to-heart? Data collection. Our entire friendship fabricated. I don't know how long I sat in that crawl space, listening, reading, piecing together the full scope of what had been done to my mother and to me. Hours, maybe. My back ached from the concrete floor. My eyes burned from reading in the LED light. Finally, I found the laptop Helen had left. It was plugged in, with an arrow pointing to a video file on the desktop labeled for Samantha. I opened it. Helen's face filled the screen. She looked exactly like I remembered from the last time I'd seen her at a family holiday 2 years ago, though visibly ill. Her face drawn. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the camera, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She wore a navy blue cardigan with wooden buttons, the same one she'd worn to every family gathering for a decade. "Samantha," she began, her voice steady despite the physical deterioration. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead, and you found my archive. Which means you're probably angry and confused, and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused, took a sip of water. "The answer is, I tried. I warned you about Justin at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Natalie behaved around him. To pay attention to the small things that didn't quite add up. You thought I was being paranoid. You said I saw conspiracies everywhere and needed to let you live your own life without interference." Helen's expression softened. "And I don't blame you for that. I'd spent decades being the family member everyone described as difficult and eccentric. The one who handed out pamphlets about corporate corruption at Thanksgiving. The one who warned about trusting people with perfect smiles and convenient explanations. By the time I tried to warn you about Justin, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said as paranoia." She adjusted the camera angle, leaning forward. "Your mother, Catherine, was my best friend long before she was your mother. We grew up protecting each other. And when she discovered what Meridian was doing, she came to me first because she knew I would help her document everything properly. We spent months building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to go to federal authorities. Then, she died in that convenient accident. And I knew exactly what had happened, even though I couldn't prove it yet." Helen coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. I could see blood on the white fabric. "I've spent the last 6 years of my life collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. Every document, every recording, every financial trail. I did it because I loved your mother, and because I love you. Because I couldn't let them get away with killing Catherine and destroying your life without any consequences." She looked directly into the camera. An intensity that made her feel like she was in the room with me. "You have 2 choices, Samantha. Just like your mother had 2 choices before they killed her. You can take the money I left you and disappear. Change your identity. Move somewhere far away. Live comfortably and safely, and never look back. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You've already lost so much. You deserve peace if that's what you want." Helen coughed again, harder this time. A long pause. "Or you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and burn these people down. Expose Meridian. Expose Justin and Natalie and everyone who participated in your mother's murder and your destruction. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You'll be threatened. You'll be harassed. You might be in danger. But Samantha, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did. She smiled. That crooked smile I remembered from childhood when she'd sneak me extra cookies, let me stay up past my bedtime reading in her library. Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night. Helen's expression became serious again. I love you, Samantha. Don't let them win. She reached for something off camera. Looked back at the screen. Oh, and there's one more thing I haven't mentioned in the written materials. Mountain Pacific Credit Union account number 77743. Password is your mother's employee number from Meridian. That's the real fortune. The $70,000 in the suitcase is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight, or use it to run. But for God's sake, use it. The video ended. Helen reaching toward the camera. Then the screen went black. I sat staring at the blank screen for a long time before I pulled up my phone and searched for Mountain Pacific Credit Union's phone number. The call took 45 minutes of navigating automated menus before I finally reached a human being. I gave them the account number Helen had mentioned. The representative went quiet. For so long, I thought the call had dropped. Ma'am, she said finally, her voice suddenly much more professional. I'm going to need to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold. The hold music was classical piano. Sounded like it was played underwater. After what felt like an eternity, a woman named Patricia came on the line, asked me to verify my identity using my mother's employee number as the password. When I gave her the numbers, she paused, then explained in careful language that Helen had established a trust in my name. The trust contains stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights that your mother secured before her death, Patricia said. The total value is approximately $14 million. Structured to protect it from legal challenges and ensure that only you can access it. $14 million. The words didn't sound real. They sounded like dialogue from a movie about someone else's life, not mine. I was sitting in a dead woman's underground archive, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and murder, and now being told that I had access to more money than I could properly comprehend. Helen had spent 6 years not just collecting evidence, but building a financial foundation to allow me to fight without being destroyed by legal fees and endless court battles. She'd wrapped justice like a gift. Left it with enough resources to actually achieve it. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Helen had left in her files, I called Agent Maria Torres at the FBI's Portland field office. She answered on the third ring. Her tone suggested she was busy. This is Torres. My name is Samantha Garrett, I said, hearing my own voice shake slightly. My Aunt Helen Vaughn left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build about Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked my phone. Where are you right now? Maria asked. Her tone completely changed. Like, specifically? At my aunt's property? Don't leave. I'm coming to you. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't touch anything else in whatever Helen left you. Just wait for me. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. Maria arrived in 35 minutes, which suggested she'd driven faster than was probably legal. She was in her late 40s, gray streaks and dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a blazer, an FBI badge clipped to her belt. She looked at me standing in Helen's overgrown backyard, an expression that was part skepticism, part hope. Show me, she said. I led her to the shed, down the ladder, into the underground archive. I watched her face change as she took it all in. The filing cabinets, the boxes, the organized documentation of 6 years of investigation. She put on latex gloves before touching anything, pulling out files, reading with an intensity that made me understand why Helen had trusted her. "Your aunt was either the most thorough investigator I've ever encountered, or she was completely brilliant," Maria said after about 20 minutes of reviewing documents. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly murder if we can prove the car accident was arranged. Samantha, you just handed me a case that could take down a major pharmaceutical company." The investigation that followed moved with a bureaucratic slowness that Maria assured me was normal. Building cases against corporations with billions in assets and armies of lawyers. Subpoenas drafted, reviewed, approved. Bank records frozen, requiring warrants, requiring probable cause, requiring more paperwork than I'd thought existed. Former Meridian employees, fired or quit under suspicious circumstances, were interviewed. The pharmaceutical industry's informal network of whistleblowers started emerging, sharing their own stories of fraud and retaliation. Maria helped me find a small apartment in Portland. One bedroom in an old building with hardwood floors that creaked, windows that rattled when trains passed. Infinitely better than room 14 at the Crossroads Motel. But I kept it modest. I didn't want to feel like I was spending resources that should be reserved for the legal battle ahead. I used money from Helen's trust to pay rent and buy groceries, living simply while the investigation moved forward. I met with prosecutors every few weeks, detailed questions about every piece of evidence Helen had collected, explaining timelines, relationships, conversations I had overheard years ago that I hadn't understood were significant at the time. They wanted to know about Justin's schedule, Natalie's visits, my mother's behavior in the months before she died. I answered everything thoroughly, watching them take notes, exchange glances. They were building something substantial. Maria called periodically with updates. "Mostly, we're making progress. Don't talk to anyone about this." It was what federal agents say when they can't share details, but want you to know you haven't been forgotten. The waiting was harder than anything that had come before. I'd handed over everything Helen had collected. And now I was just existing in limbo, hoping that the machinery of justice would actually work for once. Instead of grinding up innocent people and spitting them out as statistics. Then, months after I'd first met Maria in Helen's underground archive, things started happening with a speed that suggested the government had finally accumulated enough evidence to move forward confidently. It began on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Meridian Pharmaceuticals headquarters got raided by federal agents. Boxes carried out of that gleaming glass building, which had once looked like a monument to corporate success. The images made national news. Employees standing in the parking lot, confused and scared, while agents methodically dismantled what had seemed like an untouchable empire. Richard Moss, the CEO, whose voice I'd heard on Helen's recordings discussing my mother's murder like it was a minor inconvenience, was arrested at his home. News cameras caught footage of him, led out in handcuffs, past his neighbors, past reporters shouting questions he didn't answer, past a life that had been built on fraud and was now collapsing in real time. Maria called me that afternoon. Justin had been arrested at his office at a tech startup where he'd been working since the divorce. I watched the footage on the local news that evening, rewinding it multiple times. Apparently, I developed unhealthy coping mechanisms around witnessing karma manifest in handcuffs and perp walks. Justin maintained his composure. Didn't speak to reporters, walked with his head up like he was enduring a minor inconvenience rather than being arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. But I could see something in his eyes. Fear mixed with disbelief. Like he genuinely thought he was untouchable and was only now realizing how wrong he'd been. Natalie was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop in Seattle where she'd apparently moved after the divorce. She'd used her Meridian payments to fund a graphic design business that was actually legitimate this time. And according to the news reports, she cried during her arrest. The tears felt performative to me, given that she'd testified against me in divorce court without showing a single genuine emotion. Her attorney issued a statement claiming she'd been manipulated by Justin. Had no idea about the extent of the conspiracy, that she was a victim herself. But I'd heard the recordings of her conversations with Dr. Sarah Chin. I'd read the documents showing payments made specifically to maintain her friendship with me as a monitoring operation. Natalie hadn't been a victim. She'd been a willing participant. She'd cultivated our friendship deliberately to ensure I remained isolated and manageable after my mother's death. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every conversation where she'd encouraged me to trust Justin, to ignore my instincts, to believe that my marriage problems were normal? Calculated manipulation. The betrayal from Natalie cut deeper than Justin's. In some ways, I'd chosen to marry Justin. But Natalie had been assigned to me without my knowledge or consent. Our entire friendship, fabricated from the beginning. Then came the news about Judge Robert Cunningham. He resigned from the bench with a statement about wanting to spend more time with family, which is what corrupt officials say when they're hoping resignation will prevent criminal prosecution. It didn't work. He was indicted 3 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Documents Helen had collected showed he'd purchased a vacation home through a trust that traced back to Meridian. That he'd been ruling in favor of corporate interests for years in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Every case he'd presided over in the last decade was reviewed. My divorce case was among the first. A new judge took 15 minutes to determine that the original ruling had been based on fabricated testimony and biased proceedings. Everything Cunningham had decided was vacated, erased, like it had never happened. Maria called me the day the review of my case was completed. "Your marriage to Justin is being annulled rather than finalized as a divorce," she said. "The court's declaring it invalid from the beginning due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system, for whatever that's worth." It was worth something. Not enough to undo the damage or erase the months of suffering, but something. The formal apology arrived. A letter on official court stationery, signed by 3 judges. It acknowledged that I'd been subjected to proceedings fundamentally compromised by corruption and fabricated testimony. It expressed regret for the harm caused by a system that had failed to protect me. 2 pages of careful legal language trying to convey remorse without admitting liability. I read it once, filed it away with all the other documents that marked the destruction and slow rebuilding of my life. The apology didn't undo the months I'd spent sleeping on couches and in motel rooms. It didn't erase the trauma of watching my best friend lie, or the humiliation of losing everything because a judge had been bought. But it was acknowledgement. Official recognition that what had been done to me was wrong. The trials began 6 months after the arrests. They stretched across a year and a half. Maria had warned me cases this complex moved slowly. Building prosecutions against multiple defendants with interconnected criminal activity required patience and meticulous attention to procedural detail. She was right. The legal process ground forward with a bureaucratic thoroughness that makes glaciers look fast by comparison. Richard Moss went to trial first. His case became a media spectacle, dominated news cycles for weeks. Pharmaceutical industry whistleblowers testified about the culture of fraud at Meridian. How executives incentivized researchers to manipulate trial data. How safety concerns were systematically buried. Patients harmed by medications that should never have reached the market shared their stories. A woman whose daughter died from complications related to a drug Meridian had rushed through approval with falsified safety data spoke for 20 minutes about watching her child suffer. Forensic accountants explained money trails that connected executive bonuses directly to fraudulent approvals, showing how Richard Moss had personally profited from every dangerous medication the company brought to market. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They returned with guilty verdicts on 17 counts. Fraud, conspiracy, bribery, reckless endangerment. Richard Moss showed no visible emotion. He stood while the judge read the sentence. 23 years in federal prison. Forfeiture of approximately $40 million in assets. He was 62. He'd likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. I watched the sentencing from the gallery, sitting in the back row where I could observe without being noticed. When the judge finished and the bailiffs led Richard Moss away in handcuffs, I felt something. Not quite satisfaction, not quite closure. It was more like watching a long mathematical equation finally balance. All the variables falling into their proper places after years of deliberate miscalculation. Justin's trial was smaller, quieter, without the media attention that had surrounded Richard Moss. But it was more personal for me. I attended every day, sitting in the same seat in the back row, watching prosecutors present evidence of his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an extended intelligence gathering operation. The recordings Helen had collected were played in court. I listened to Justin's voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle. Heard him report on conversations I'd had about her work. Heard him strategize about how to use our relationship for information gathering. Prosecutors presented bank records showing payments made to him throughout our marriage, demonstrating that he'd been compensated for every month he'd spent pretending to love me. His defense attorney tried to argue he'd been a low-level participant, manipulated by more powerful people, coerced. But the recordings showed someone who'd been enthusiastic, willing, who'd made strategic suggestions about how to approach my mother's murder, who'd continued receiving payments and participating in the conspiracy years after her death. The jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Justin looked at me across the courtroom. His expression was complicated, something between anger and resignation, as if he couldn't quite believe that the woman he'd married as part of a surveillance operation had been the one to bring the evidence that destroyed him. I looked back without blinking. Without emotion. Because I was done being intimidated by people who'd systematically underestimated what I was capable of when pushed far enough. Natalie accepted a plea deal rather than going to trial. In exchange for testimony against other defendants, her sentence was reduced to 8 years. She provided information about Dr. Sarah Chin and other Meridian employees who'd been part of the conspiracy, helping prosecutors build cases against people who might otherwise have escaped accountability. 6 months after her sentencing, I received a letter from her. 3 pages written on prison stationery, full of apologies, explanations about how she'd been young and desperate for money when Meridian first approached her. How she'd made terrible choices. How being assigned to befriend me had started as just a job, but had become complicated when she'd actually grown to care about me despite the lies. She asked if we could eventually find a way to forgive each other and move forward, because our friendship had meant something real, even though it was built on deception. I read the letter once, sitting in my Portland apartment with my morning coffee. I felt nothing but a hollow kind of satisfaction. The letter was self-justification dressed up in the language of remorse, trying to rewrite history so Natalie could see herself as a victim instead of an active participant in destroying another person's life. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed the letter away in a folder with other evidence of betrayal and never responded. Some relationships can't be repaired, and shouldn't be attempted. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Meridian Pharmaceuticals took another 2 years to resolve. The company fought aggressively, deploying teams of lawyers to challenge every claim, dragging out proceedings. But eventually, facing the weight of evidence that had already resulted in criminal convictions for their executives, they settled. The terms required Meridian to pay $2.7 billion to patients harmed by their fraudulent drug approvals. They had to fund independent safety reviews of every medication they'd brought to market in the past decade. They were placed under federal monitoring for 15 years, with regulators embedded in their approval processes to prevent future fraud. My mother's estate received $12 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative, and I donated every dollar to organizations that advocate for pharmaceutical safety and transparency. The money felt tainted, earned through my mother's murder, and I already had enough resources from Helen's trust to live comfortably without it. Instead, I used part of Helen's trust to start the Vaughn Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers who risk their careers to expose corporate misconduct. We hired investigators, funded legal defenses, published reports that made pharmaceutical companies uncomfortable, shining light into corners where they preferred darkness. The foundation became my full-time work. My way of channeling grief and anger into something productive, something that would have made my mother and Helen proud, something that turned their deaths into a legacy that actually helped people instead of just being tragic endings to lives cut short by greed. I still think about room 14 at the Crossroads Motel. Sometimes about sitting on that sagging bed, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last week there in my wallet as a reminder that rock bottom is real. That humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you. But they can't actually destroy you unless you let them. Helen had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case and assembling resources because she believed truth mattered more than comfort and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid woman everyone dismissed had been the only one who truly understood how the world actually worked. Who recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. The final truth Helen left me proved prophetic in ways I'm still discovering. Fighting doesn't always lead to winning, but not fighting guarantees losing. I built a meaningful life from the ruins of a fraudulent one. Messy, complicated, and fundamentally honest. The kind of ending my mother and Helen would have appreciated. The kind of story that reminds people that patience and documentation can topple empires built on lies. And that sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply refusing to let corrupt people erase you from the narrative they've constructed around their own importance. I'm not the woman I was when I found that suitcase under the motel bed. I'm stronger than she was, more careful about trust, but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. And I'm grateful I'm not her anymore. If this story of justice and resilience kept you captivated until the very end, show your support by hitting that like button right now. My favorite part was when Samantha discovered Helen's underground archive and realized her paranoid aunt had been right about everything all along. What was your favorite moment? Tell me what you think, I really want to know. Thanks for watching. Take care.